Sometimes, the richest people discover the true value of life in the simplest moments, and a stranger's kindness can change everything. Daniel Morgan was the kind of man who made headlines without even trying. His name appeared in glossy magazines, his face showed up on business news channels, and his empire stretched across industries that most people could only dream of touching. He was the billionaire people admired from a distance, the symbol of success many wanted to become. But behind all the fame and fortune, there was another side of him that almost no one saw. He was a father, not the kind anyone would envy. Daniel had a 6-year-old son named Ethan. The boy had bright blue eyes and a laugh that could melt hearts, but unfortunately, his laughter rarely echoed in the massive mansion they lived in. The house had polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls covered with priceless art, but what it lacked most was warmth. Ethan's days were filled with nannies, tutors, and private lessons, all chosen carefully by Daniel to shape his son into someone who would one day take over the family empire. To outsiders, it seemed Ethan had everything: luxury cars to be driven in, designer clothes to wear, and the best education money could buy. Yet what the boy longed for most was something that couldn't be bought: his father's attention. Daniel believed he was doing the right thing. He thought love was shown through providing the best life possible, even if that life came without hugs or playtime. In his mind, discipline was love. He remembered his own childhood being raised by a stern father who never once played catch or told him bedtime stories, but who drilled into him the values of hard work and ambition. Daniel had followed that path, and it had made him one of the most powerful men in the country. He assumed Ethan would benefit from the same strictness. What he didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't like him. Ethan often tried to break through the wall around his father's heart. Sometimes he would run into Daniel's office, holding a drawing he made, hoping to get a smile or even a nod of approval. Daniel would glance at it briefly, say, "That's nice," and then return to his laptop or phone, leaving Ethan standing there with his little hands clutching the paper tighter. Other times, Ethan would beg him to play with toy cars or to come outside and kick a ball, but Daniel would always have a meeting, a call, or an email that seemed more urgent. Each rejection, though delivered without harshness, cut deeper into Ethan's little world. He didn't understand why his father, the man he admired most, never wanted to join in his games. The truth was, Daniel wasn't a cruel man. He didn't intend to hurt his son, just didn't know how to show softness. For years, he had trained himself to be tough, calculating, and distant, because that was how business worked. You couldn't survive in boardrooms by crawling on the floor with toy cars. You couldn't win billion-dollar deals by wasting time on silly laughter. In his mind, he was protecting Ethan by preparing him early for the harsh realities of life. But in reality, he was building an invisible wall between himself and his child. The staff in the mansion noticed it. The nanny saw the way Ethan's eyes lit up when Daniel walked into the room, and how quickly they dimmed again when his father barely looked at him. The maids overheard the boy whispering to his stuffed animals at night, telling them stories he wished he could share with his dad. Even the chauffeur once saw Ethan pressing his small hand against the tinted car window, staring at other families in the park laughing together, and wondered if the boy envied them, but no one dared say anything. Daniel was their employer, and his reputation for discipline extended to his household. Despite all this, Ethan still adored his father. Every child wants to believe their parent is the greatest person in the world, and Ethan was no different. When people at his private school asked what his father did, he proudly said, "My dad is the boss of everything." The back of the shiny black car, pretending he was important just like his father. But deep down, he didn't want the cars or the clothes or the house. He just wanted to sit on the floor and build Lego towers with his dad or laugh together over cartoons. His heart longed for the kind of love that couldn't be measured in dollars. Daniel, on the other hand, kept his emotions locked away. He spent his mornings on conference calls, his afternoons in meetings, and his evenings reviewing documents. Even when he was physically present, his mind was elsewhere thinking about the next deal, the next investment, the next empire to conquer. To him, childhood was just a stage that would pass. And once Ethan grew older, he believed their relationship would naturally fall into place. He didn't see that the years slipping by were the most important ones, the ones that would shape Ethan, forever. There were moments, however, when cracks appeared in Daniel's armor. Late at night, after the house had grown quiet, he would sometimes pause outside Ethan's bedroom door. He would hear his son's soft breathing, the innocence of sleep filling the room, and feel a tug in his chest. He would think about opening the door, tucking the blanket around him, or kissing his forehead. But every time, he stopped himself. Affection didn't come naturally to him. Instead, he convinced himself that providing was enough, that one day Ethan would understand. The truth was, Daniel was also lonely. His wife had passed away when Ethan was still a toddler, and the grief had hardened him further. Losing her had made him bury his softer side deeper than ever. To cope, he threw himself into work, telling himself he was building a future for Ethan. What he didn't realize was that his son didn't need a bigger future. He needed a present filled with love. People around Daniel praised him constantly. Business partners called him a genius. Journalists described him as unstoppable. Investors saw him as a golden ticket. But none of those compliments touched the emptiness that sometimes echoed inside him. Success had brought him power, but it hadn't brought him peace. When he looked at Ethan, he sometimes caught a glimpse of the boy's longing eyes, and for a brief second, he wondered if he was failing at the one role that mattered most. But just as quickly, he would bury that thought, because acknowledging it meant facing a truth he wasn't ready to accept. Ethan, meanwhile, kept hoping. Every morning he woke up thinking, maybe today Dad will play with me. Every evening, he went to sleep with that same hope, tucked under his pillow. And even when the day ended without it happening, he refused to stop wishing. In his young heart, he still believed that one day his father would notice the little boy standing right in front of him. That was the reality of Daniel Morgan's life. To the world, he was the picture of success, the billionaire who had everything. But behind closed doors, he was a man who didn't know how to be a father, and a little boy who was slowly learning what it felt like to grow up without the warmth of love he craved most. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to take a turn they couldn't have imagined, a turn that would challenge everything Daniel thought he knew about success, love, and what it truly meant to be a dad. The next chapter of Daniel Morgan's life unfolded on a quiet evening that was never supposed to be special. He had been traveling for business with his son, Ethan, moving from one city to another, meeting investors and signing contracts there. Days were filled with hotel rooms, limousines, and luxury boardrooms that had no space for the laughter of a child. Ethan, though only 6, had already learned how to behave like a little adult whenever he was near his father. He stayed quiet, played with his toy cars in silence, and waited patiently while his dad spoke about numbers and deals he could not understand. But inside he longed for a simple joy, someone to notice him, to laugh with him, to see him as more than a small shadow in the corner. That evening, Daniel's driver pulled into a small town after hours of travel. It was one of those places that didn't know or care about billionaires. The streets had simple shops, the lights were warm, and people walked slowly, without the rush of big cities. Daniel had planned to eat at the hotel's fine dining restaurant, but Ethan's small voice interrupted. "Dad, can we eat somewhere else? Not the hotel? Somewhere different?" Daniel almost said no, out of habit. But when he looked at Ethan's tired little face, something in him softened, just a bit. He nodded, surprising even himself. They ended up at a small diner on the corner of Main Street. Its neon sign flickered, and the smell of freshly baked pies floated out as the door opened. The place was nothing like what Daniel was used to. There were no velvet chairs or golden chandeliers. Instead, there were red leather booths, a jukebox in the corner, and the chatter of locals enjoying their meals. It was a place where people came to feel at home, not to impress anyone. Daniel stepped inside in his tailored suit, instantly standing out, while Ethan's eyes widened with wonder. For once, the boy seemed curious and excited, not bored. A young waitress named Sarah came to their table. She wore a simple uniform, her hair tied back in a ponytail, and her smile carried a warmth that could make strangers feel like friends. She greeted them cheerfully, not recognizing or caring that Daniel was a billionaire. To her, he was just another customer with a child. She placed menus on the table, and asked Ethan what he would like. Unlike most adults who usually ignored him and spoke only to his father, Sarah looked directly at him, waiting for his answer. Ethan hesitated at first, unused to being treated with such attention, then shyly asked for pancakes. Sarah's kindness didn't end there. When she brought the food, she chatted with Ethan about his toy car sitting on the table. "That's a fast one," she said with a wink, making the boy grin. Daniel watched silently, not sure what to make of it. He wasn't used to strangers speaking so freely to his son. Usually people around them were formal, careful, and overly respectful, always mindful of Daniel's status. But Sarah didn't seem to care about status. She was natural, simple, and unafraid to be playful. Then came the moment that would stay etched in Daniel's mind forever. Ethan, while playing with his car between bites of pancakes, accidentally dropped it under the table. His little face fell in disappointment, and he bent down to try and reach it. Before Daniel could react, Sarah laughed lightly, got down on her hands and knees, and crawled under the table. To Ethan's surprise, she didn't just pick up the car, she started pushing it along the floor, making silly engine noises. "Vroom, vroom, look out, here comes the fastest car in town," she said, her voice filled with laughter. Eyes sparkled, and soon he joined her on the floor. Giggling as he raced his toy car alongside hers, Daniel sat frozen, completely stunned by what he was seeing. A waitress in a small diner, crawling on the floor without a care, laughing with his son as though nothing else in the world mattered. Ahead, his son, his quiet, lonely Ethan, was laughing so hard that the sound filled the diner. It wasn't the polite little chuckle Daniel sometimes heard. It was real, pure, bubbling joy. The kind that children are meant to have. Other diners glanced over, some smiling at the sight, others chuckling at the silliness. But Sarah didn't care about being watched, and neither did Ethan. In that moment, the two of them were in their own world, racing cars across the linoleum floor as though it was the most important race in history. Daniel's heart tightened as he watched. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen Ethan this happy. He realized with a strange ache that he himself had never gotten down on the floor to play with his son like that. Minutes passed, but Daniel didn't stop them. He didn't tell Sarah to stand up or scold Ethan for being childish in public. He just sat there, silent, watching. His polished shoes and expensive suit felt oddly out of place in that booth, while the waitress in a simple uniform seemed to hold the secret to something priceless. He found himself asking questions in his head. Why couldn't he do what she was doing? Why did it feel so natural for her to connect with his son, while for him it felt impossible? When Sarah finally stood up, her knees dusty from the floor, she handed Ethan his toy car with a dramatic bow. "Winner of the championship race," she declared, making the boy cheer and clap. She smiled warmly at Daniel, as though to say, "Your son is wonderful," without needing words. Daniel managed a small nod, but inside, he felt something shift. As the evening went on, Sarah continued to treat Ethan like the center of the universe. She asked him about his favorite games, told him funny stories about her clumsy cat at home, and even showed him how to make silly faces with the straw wrappers. Ethan soaked it all in, glowing with happiness. For once, he wasn't the billionaire son sitting quietly in the background. He was just a child, seen and cherished by someone who cared enough to notice. Daniel's food sat almost untouched. He kept glancing between his son and the waitress, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, an ache of regret mixed with admiration. He was used to controlling every situation, but here he was, powerless against the simple power of human kindness. He had spent millions on toys, tutors, and luxury, yet none of it had made Ethan's eyes light up the way they did now. In this tiny diner, because a young woman had chosen to crawl on the floor and laugh with him, the moment was simple, ordinary. Even but to Daniel, it was extraordinary. It was a glimpse into a world he had denied himself and his son for too long. Watching Ethan's happiness unfold before him, Daniel couldn't ignore the quiet truth pressing at his heart. Money could buy almost anything, but it couldn't buy this. Daniel had lived many years believing he understood everything about life. To him, the rules were simple. Work hard, win every battle, and never let emotions distract you. But that evening in the diner, something began to crumble inside him. It started with the sound of his son's laughter, loud, carefree, and so alive that it filled the little room with joy.
Ow.
It wasn't just a laugh. It was a sound Daniel had been starving to hear without even knowing it. Each giggle from Ethan felt like a reminder of all the moments he had missed. All the chances he had let slip away because he was too busy being strong, too busy being a man of power. He sat stiffly in the booth, his hands clasped tightly together. On the table, watching Sarah and Ethan, every second that passed felt heavier on his chest. His son's small hands pushed the toy car across the floor, his face glowing with excitement as Sarah made silly racing noises. She didn't care that people were watching. She didn't care that her uniform was getting wrinkled, or that she looked ridiculous crawling beside a 6-year-old. She cared only about making the boy smile, and Ethan. Oh, Ethan looked so happy, so alive. As if this little race was the best moment of his life, Daniel realized with a painful jolt that he had never seen his son like this. Yes, Ethan had smiled at gifts and toys before, but this was different. This wasn't the smile of a child politely saying thank you. This was pure joy, the kind of happiness that couldn't be faked. It was the laughter of a boy who felt noticed, valued, and loved in the simplest way. And it wasn't Daniel who had given him that joy. It was a stranger. For years, Daniel had convinced himself that he was doing everything right. He gave Ethan the best schools, the best clothes, the best life money could offer. But as he sat there, watching, it dawned on him that none of it mattered if his son's heart remained empty. He had thought being a father meant being a provider, a protector, a teacher, but maybe, just maybe, being a father also meant being willing to crawl on the floor and laugh without caring about dignity. That idea felt foreign to him, almost uncomfortable, because he had spent so many years hiding behind pride. Yet in that moment, he couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. He remembered nights when Ethan had come into his office holding a drawing, his little eyes full of hope. Daniel had barely looked at it before turning back to his laptop. He remembered mornings when Ethan had asked if he could play outside with him. He had replied, "Not now, I have a meeting." He remembered birthdays where the boy's gifts had been wrapped in ribbons, but handed to him without hugs. Each memory stung him now like tiny knives, because for the first time, he understood what those moments had meant to his son. They weren't just little requests, they were pleas for connection. And every time, he had failed to answer. Sarah's laughter filled the air again as she declared Ethan the champion of the car race. The boy's eyes sparkled with pride. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to join them, to kneel down beside his son and push a toy car across the floor, but his body stayed frozen. Something deep inside held him back, fear, pride, habit. He wondered if Ethan would even want him there, or if the boy had already given up hope that his father could ever be that person. When Sarah returned to the booth, brushing dust from her knees, Ethan climbed back onto the seat, his cheeks flushed with happiness. "Dad, did you see that? I won," he said, his voice bursting with excitement. Daniel looked at him, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Words felt heavy, trapped in his throat. He wanted to say, "Yes, I saw. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry for all the times I wasn't there." But all that came out was a stiff smile and a quiet, "Yes, I saw." Ethan, innocent as always, accepted it without noticing the storm brewing inside his father. He turned back to Sarah, chatting eagerly, while Daniel sank deeper into silence. He felt like an outsider watching his son form a bond with someone. He had just met a bond that felt stronger than the one they shared after years together. That realization was painful. It was also humbling, for the first time in his life. Daniel Morgan, the man who controlled empires, felt powerless. He studied Sarah as she poured coffee into his cup. There was nothing extraordinary about her. At first glance, she was young, working in a diner, probably struggling to make ends meet. She didn't have riches or fame or power, but she had something he lacked: the ability to give love freely. She didn't overthink it, didn't guard herself, didn't measure her actions against pride or status. She simply gave, without expecting anything in return. And in giving, she had managed to touch his son's heart in a way Daniel had never done. As he watched Ethan laughing at another one of Sarah's silly jokes, Daniel felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was envy because she could reach his son so easily. There was guilt because he had failed to do the same. And there was fear because he realized that if he didn't change, he might lose Ethan's love forever. Not lose it in a dramatic way, but lose it quietly, slowly, until the boy no longer looked at him with hope, till he stopped asking for attention, until the distance between them became too wide to cross. The thought haunted him. He imagined Ethan growing up, becoming a teenager, then a man, carrying with him the memory of a father who was always too busy, too cold, too distant. He imagined himself old and alone in his mansion, with billions in the bank but no bond with the only person who truly mattered. For the first time, Daniel saw his future clearly, and it terrified him. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Ethan chattered happily with Sarah, showing her tricks with his toy car, while Daniel sat quietly, lost in his thoughts. He nodded politely when spoken to, but inside he was fighting a war with himself. A part of him resisted, clinging to the old belief that discipline and provision were enough. But another part, stronger and louder, whispered that he had been wrong all along. That whisper grew louder each time he looked at Ethan's smiling face. When they finally stood to leave, Sarah bent down to Ethan's level, giving him a playful salute. "Race you again next time, champ," she said. Ethan giggled, clutching his toy car to his chest. Daniel watched the exchange, his chest heavy. He wanted to thank her, to tell her she had given him something priceless that evening, but the words felt too big to say. Instead, he nodded again, slipping a generous tip onto the table. Though deep down he knew no amount of money could repay what she had given him. As they walked out into the cool night air, Ethan skipped happily beside him, humming to himself. Daniel glanced down at his son, and for once, he didn't see the future heir to his empire. He saw a little boy, fragile, hopeful, and desperately in need of a father who could give him more than money. That night, for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to admit what he had been denying for years. He wasn't the father Ethan needed him to be.
Ow.
But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. When Daniel left the diner that night, he could not get Sarah's face out of his mind. The image of her kneeling on the floor, laughing with his son, as if the world outside did not exist, kept replaying over and over. He had meetings to think about, calls to answer, and documents waiting for his signature, but none of that seemed as important anymore. For the first time in years, his carefully built world of business and money felt small compared to the simple lesson he had just witnessed. He spent that night lying awake in the hotel room while Ethan slept peacefully beside him, hugging his toy car. Daniel stared at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled. He had always believed that love could be shown through giving the biggest house, the best education, the most expensive toys. But Sarah had nothing to give except her time and her kindness. And yet she had made his son glow with happiness in a way he never had. That truth stung him. It forced him to question everything he thought he knew. The next morning, when he looked at Ethan's cheerful face, he realized how blind he had been. His son was only 6, yet already Daniel could see how easily he had been pushing him into loneliness. He remembered how Sarah spoke to Ethan directly, kneeling to his level as if he mattered. He remembered how she laughed freely, how she cared without asking for anything in return. And suddenly, Daniel wanted to know more about her. Who was she? Why was she working in that small diner? How did she manage to carry such light inside her despite what must have been a difficult life? Later that day, Daniel returned to the diner, this time without Ethan. He felt strangely nervous as he walked in, almost like a schoolboy unsure of himself. Sarah was there, balancing plates and greeting customers with the same warm smile. When she came over to his table, he thanked her for the way she had treated his son the night before. She brushed it off lightly, saying, "He's a wonderful kid. Just needed someone to play with." That. But Daniel pressed further, wanting to know about her at first. Sarah hesitated, but eventually she shared pieces of her life. She was 26. Living in a small apartment with her sick mother who needed constant care, she worked double shifts at the diner and sometimes cleaned offices at night to cover medical bills. Her life was not easy, but she refused to let it break her spirit. "If I stop smiling, If I stop finding little joys, then what's left? She said, her eyes shining with quiet strength. Daniel listened, feeling something he hadn't felt. In years, respect that went beyond business achievements. Here was a young woman who had no wealth, no fame, and no powerful connections. Yet she carried more courage and heart than most people he knew in boardrooms. She had no millions to fall back on, yet she still managed to give love freely, not just to her mother, but to strangers, even to a little boy she had just met. For Daniel, it was humbling. He thought of himself again, of all the times he had chosen money over moments, of how cold he had become without even realizing it. He wondered if Sarah had unknowingly held a mirror up to him, showing him the emptiness that lived inside his wealth. That evening, when he returned to Ethan, he tried something different. Instead of burying himself in his laptop, he sat on the floor of the hotel room and asked his son to show him how to race cars. Ethan looked at him in surprise, his little eyes wide, as if he could not believe his father was really asking that. For a second, Daniel almost pulled back, embarrassed. But then Ethan grinned, dropped his toy car on the carpet, and said, "Okay, Dad, you'd be the blue one." They played awkwardly at first, Daniel stiff and unsure. But soon, Ethan's laughter filled the room again. And this time it wasn't Sarah he was laughing with. It was his father. Daniel realized how simple it was, how little it took to make his son happy. Not millions, not gold, not the biggest toys. Just his presence, just his willingness to step out of his world and into Ethan's, even for a few minutes. That night, when Ethan fell asleep with a smile on his face, Daniel felt something inside him shift again. He felt lighter, freer, as if he had been carrying chains he didn't even know were there. The days that followed were different. Daniel kept returning to the diner, sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone. He found himself drawn to Sarah, not in the way of a man seeking romance, but in the way of a man seeking truth. Each conversation with her reminded him of what really mattered: kindness, connection, humanity. She never once asked him about his wealth, never once treated him differently after she learned who he was. To her, he wasn't the billionaire Daniel Morgan. He was just a man, a father, trying to understand his son. One evening, Daniel asked Sarah how she managed to stay so hopeful despite her struggles. She shrugged and said, "Life is hard for everyone, in different ways. I can't change that. But I can choose how I face it. And if I can make even one person smile, even for a minute, then my day wasn't wasted." Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after he left. He began to notice small things he had ignored before. The way Ethan's hand slipped quietly into his when they crossed the street. The way his son's face lit up when he bent down to tie his shoe instead of asking the nanny. The way bedtime stories, simple as they were, made Ethan's eyes grow heavy with comfort. These were things he had never given importance to before. But now he saw them as treasures. Slowly, the wall around his heart began to crack. Daniel found himself laughing more, not the polite laugh he used in meetings, but real laughter, the kind that bubbled out unexpectedly. He found himself listening to Ethan's stories, even when they were about imaginary superheroes and silly adventures. He began to realize that love wasn't something to schedule or delegate, was something to live. Every day, all of this had started because of Sarah, because one young woman had shown him, without meaning to, what it meant to give without measure. She became a lesson he could not ignore. She taught him that strength wasn't in building empires, but in kneeling down to a child's level. She taught him that success wasn't in wealth, but in connection. For Daniel, it was a revelation. He had spent his entire life chasing numbers, thinking they defined him. But now he was beginning to see that his real worth was not measured in billions, but in the bond he built with his son. And as he tucked Ethan into bed one night, hearing his boy whisper, "I love you, Dad," he knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that no amount of money could ever buy. From that night onward, Daniel Morgan's life began to change in ways he had never imagined. The shift was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it was real. He woke up with a new determination, not for business deals or profit margins, but for something far more valuable: to become a father who truly mattered to his son. Ethan, still unaware of the internal transformation taking place within his father, began to notice small changes. Daniel laughed more freely, listened more carefully, and, most importantly, spent time with him without distractions. The following morning, Daniel insisted that Ethan choose what they would do for the day. Could have been anything: a park, a small cafe, or even just playing in their hotel room. Ethan chose the park. When they arrived, Daniel didn't just sit on a bench scrolling through his phone as he had in the past. He ran with Ethan, kicked a soccer ball, and even let the boy climb on his shoulders. Other parents watched, some nodding in approval, some simply smiling at the sight of a father finally being present for his child. Ethan's laughter rang out over the grass, and for the first time, Daniel truly felt the depth of his own joy, that the shallow satisfaction of a business win. But the deep, enduring happiness that came from being a real part of his son's world. As days passed, Daniel made it a habit to step away from the endless demands of his empire and focus on Ethan. They built Lego towers that stretched from floor to ceiling, painted pictures that ended up on the refrigerator, and even started a small collection of toy cars that they raced across every available surface. Each moment spent in Ethan's presence was a lesson for Daniel in humility and love. He realized that while money could buy comfort, it could never buy connection. That realization drove him to be better, not just for Ethan, but for himself. Daniel also returned to the diner, this time with a purpose. He wanted to thank Sarah properly, and, if possible, support her in some way. When he arrived, he saw her juggling tables and orders, still radiant with the same warmth that had captivated him. Daniel approached cautiously, not sure how to explain the depth of his gratitude. "You've taught me something very important," he said finally. "It's not just to play with my son, but to really be present for him." Sarah smiled, modest and unassuming, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Sometimes all it takes is noticing what matters," she replied. Over the following weeks, Daniel offered to help Sarah and her mother with medical bills and living expenses, not as an act of charity, but as a genuine gesture of gratitude. She accepted cautiously, but Daniel insisted it was not a handout. It was respect for the way she had shown him what fatherhood could truly be. In their conversations, Daniel often found himself learning more than just about Sarah's life. He learned about resilience, kindness, and the quiet power of giving without expecting anything in return. Each interaction left a mark on him slowly, shaping him into the father he had always wanted to be but didn't know how. Back at home, Daniel began implementing these lessons daily. He created new routines with Ethan: breakfasts, where they talked about dreams, afternoons for play, evenings for bedtime stories. He even started sharing small, personal moments from his own childhood, stories he had never told anyone, to show Ethan that it was okay to be vulnerable. Ethan responded with trust and laughter, slowly filling the gap that had existed between them for so long. Daniel noticed that the boy's confidence and happiness grew each day, and with it, his own sense of fulfillment expanded. One evening, as they were building an elaborate train set on the living room floor, Ethan looked up at his father and said, "Dad, I like it when we play together like this. Can we do it every day?" Daniel smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yes, we can," he replied softly. It was a simple promise, yet it carried a weight far heavier than any business contract Daniel had ever signed. It was a commitment to love, to presence, and to change. As months went by, the bond between father and son deepened. Daniel found himself not just participating in Ethan's world, but learning from it. He discovered patience he never knew he had, joy in simple pleasures, and humility in moments of play. Boardroom meetings no longer consumed every thought. Instead, he measured success by the smiles he earned from Ethan, the laughter they shared, and the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Money still mattered in the world, but at home, it took a back seat to love, attention, and presence. Ethan's friends noticed the change as well. He was more open, cheerful, and confident. He talked proudly about his father playing soccer with him, reading stories, and racing cars on the floor. Teachers observed a boy who seemed more secure and happy than before, a boy whose home life was suddenly full of warmth and attention. And Daniel, for the first time, realized that his wealth could never have created this transformation on its own. It required something far more valuable: genuine connection, humility, and willingness to change, eventually. Daniel began sharing his experiences with other parents in his life, quietly encouraging them to invest in their children not through money, but through presence. He became an advocate for spending time with loved ones, often recounting his own mistakes and the lessons he learned from Sarah and Ethan. People who had once admired him solely for his business acumen began to respect him for his humanity. His story became an example that true success was measured not by wealth, but by love and connection. As for Sarah, she remained a bright presence in their lives. Daniel never saw her as just a waitress again. She was a teacher, a reminder of what really mattered. She and Ethan formed a lasting friendship, and Daniel ensured that she and her mother had the support they needed. It was not about payment or obligation. It was about gratitude, respect, and the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the largest impact. One quiet evening, Daniel sat on the couch, with Ethan nestled beside him, reading a storybook about a father and son who went on adventures together. Ethan's head rested against Daniel's shoulder, his small hand in his father's. Daniel felt a profound peace he had never known. He had wealth, yes, but more importantly, he had the love of his son. The lessons from that small diner, from Sarah's laughter and generosity, had changed him completely. He understood now that being a father was not about perfection or status or material gifts. It was about being present, showing love, and cherishing every moment with the child you hold dear. In that moment, Daniel realized that everything he had thought he knew about life had been incomplete. He had been chasing the wrong goals, thinking that money and power defined success. But watching Ethan's happiness, feeling the warmth of his hand in his own, and remembering the night Sarah had crawled on the diner floor to make a child laugh, he finally understood the truth. The richest life is measured not by wealth, but by the love we give and the bonds we create. From then on, Daniel's world was forever transformed. He was no longer just a billionaire with an empire. He was a father who truly knew his son, a man who had learned the priceless value of human connection, and a person capable of giving love freely. And in the eyes of Ethan, he became not just a provider, but a hero, a playmate, and a parent who had finally discovered how to be present in the most meaningful ways. Their laughter, once missing from the halls of his mansion, now filled the rooms daily, and Daniel knew without doubt that he had finally found the success that truly mattered.